Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this afternoon program with our guest today, Dr. Meredith D. Clark. This is going to be a valuable conversation. So if you have a colleague or a fellow member at Rice that you think would be interested in joining in, please reach out to them to join us. So I am Dr. Ijeoma Nwaogu. I am the Associate Director for the Multicultural Center here at Rice University with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'd like to acknowledge our partners for this program, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the Jones Graduate School of Business, and the Owl In Initiative via Rice Athletics. For this program, Dr. Clark will engage us in a discussion about the notion of cancel culture, along with its origin and its use in society. You might be wondering, what is this cancel culture thing? So here's the internet definition of cancel culture. It's defined as a modern form of ostracism in which someone is thrust out of social or professional circles, whether it be online or social media or in person. With our programming in the Multicultural Center, we aim to host conversations around current events that are related to diversity and inclusion. And we found that we've been there have been plenty of conversations around this topic this year. Some people are asking, is it time to cancel culture? Is there such a thing as cancel culture? Is it ever good to cancel someone? Is it a toxic trend? Is it an approach for accountability? Is there room for restoration, redemption, empathy, or compassion for individuals that are viewed as abusers, violators, or offenders? Is it a fear-based reaction or a thoughtful response? Is calling someone out the same as canceling them? One thing is that much of it is rooted in a distrust of an unjust system, leading to people in society to take matters into their own hands. These are a few of the thoughts that have been circling through the minds of many. So the goal of this program is for each of us to gain a better understanding of the multiple perspectives around the notion and learn new insights to reflect upon for future considerations. And we are so thankful for Dr. Clark, who is with us today to share her knowledge on this topic. The format of this program today is to hear from Dr. Clark and engage by asking any questions you may have. So I encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A section. When you're typing your questions, we ask that you submit direct questions for Dr. Clark. We request this because it can become a bit of a challenge to find the question if it's embedded within your comments. You are welcome to utilize the chat feature for any general comments. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Clark, and I'd like to share a bit of information about her. Dr. Clark is a journalist and assistant professor in media studies at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, media, and power in digital, social, and news media. She was named the Root 100 in 2015 for her dissertation research on Black Twitter. She is featured in the CBSN documentary, Speaking Frankly, where she spoke about cancel culture, as she will do with us for today. Her book on Black Twitter and Black digital resistance is under contract with Oxford University Press. Her most recent article, titled Drag Them, A Brief Etymology of Cancel Culture, was published in Communication and the Public in 2020. Her research has also been published in Electronic News, Journalism, and Mass Communication Educator, Journal of Social Media and Society, New Media and Society, and Social Movement Studies. Clark is an in-demand research consultant on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in media. She is joining us today from Charlottesville, Virginia. I welcome you, Dr. Clark. The space is yours.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I am speaking to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, which I must acknowledge sits on the unceded territory of the Manahoac and the Monacan peoples. I am speaking to you directly from University of Virginia, which was built with the labor of enslaved Africans. I say these things to give some context for the text that I am about to talk about, this issue of cancel culture. to let you know a little bit about the way I approach my research and what I want to share with you today. That is how much we lose in translation when words, phrases, and particular framing is taken out of its original context, and we fail to think about the people who created that language, the purpose for which they created it, and how it has been abused and misused in modern societies. So I'm going to take over here for a moment, doing a little screen sharing, if I can get my Zoom to cooperate with me. Here we are. You would think that a year into the pandemic, I'd be used to this, but still not quite, even though we just practiced it. And I've lost some slides. There we go. Okay. So this talk is Called Out, Called In, and Canceled, the racial grammar of digital accountability practice. And I encourage you, if you are a person who, like me, is extremely online, if you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet parts of this talk. It's information that I've covered before extensively, have written about in my forthcoming book, and do have an article out about. So let's go back a little ways. We're going back to July of 2020. None of us wants to remember this time. None of us wants to go back here. But I found it really interesting in July of 2020 that more than 150 writers, academics, professionals who make their living and have raised their social profile in the words or in the world of words authored this letter for Harper's Magazine. The letter appeared in July talking about an issue of justice and open debate. And in fact, the authors of this letter mentioned in it that they were concerned about how open debate was being stifled. They talked about the consequences for people who misspoke, who said something that others deemed unsavory. They mentioned everything except those two words, cancel culture. But those of us who had followed internet discourse for a while knew exactly what they were getting at, talking about the threat to free speech and democracy, the threat to unpopular ideas being suppressed and being subjected to the spiral of silence. I took issue with this letter in the same way that I've taken issue with some of the conversations around what it means for someone to be quote unquote canceled, because it failed to acknowledge the people and the culture from which this actual language evolved from. Today, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey about the phrase that we know as cancel culture, its origins in Black and specifically Black queer cultures, how it crossed over into the mainstream in digital cultures, and what we can do to push back against so-called cancel culture. Taking it a further step back, in June of 2018, I sat for this interview with Jonah Engle-Bromwich from the New York Times to talk about everyone is canceled. What does it mean to be canceled, Jonah asked me. And I told him it's a strategic divestment of someone's time, attention, or other resources. It's a response that someone makes because there's harm that has been done to their communities. Perhaps they've even been harmed themselves. As I told Jonah at this time, canceling someone isn't without its analog antecedents. Consider, for instance, blacklisting or boycotting. To do the former, you have to have a significant amount of power. Blacklisting remains the realm of those who cast movies, as we've seen with the recent controversy about Scott Rudin. It remains the powerful technique that producers, directors, casting agents can use to keep someone from getting perhaps a big screen break or a television show. In our own world, in academia, blacklisting is that type of silencing and suppression that keeps someone from having their ideas published or shared widely, disseminated. Boycotting, which we're all closely familiar with, thanks to our history and connection to the civil rights movement, is something that more people can practice. Anyone effectively can stage a boycott, whether you are an individual who has decided that you'll no longer patronize a restaurant because of their particular stance, or you're someone who's standing in a larger boycott against a company, or even a high-profile individual and their businesses because of something they've done that is objectionable to you. In this moment, I want you to consider that canceling is not a new phenomenon. It's not even a new phenomenon among the queer communities that it originated in. We have always had mechanisms for using shame in order to move our fellow human beings to more desirable courses of action. But what is it that happens to be just so biting about being canceled? Well, in recent years, as I studied the internet, I happened to follow some of the cancellations of some high-profile people and brands. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a blogger with mention of the products Shea Moisture, which are natural hair care products that were targeted towards African-American women. The brand itself was the brainchild of an African woman who had immigrated from Liberia to the United States and used Shea to help support her family by creating these products and selling them. Her sons took over the line, and in the early 2000s, they launched a line that positioned white women's hair struggles as similar to those struggles that Black women face. Where Black women are actually kept from wearing their natural hair in the workplace, this was particularly offensive to the Black natural hair bloggers who had followed along with this company, who had praised its products, and who had asked people to support them. Shea Moisture effectually got canceled because it forgot about its customer base. Moving clockwise to the right, you'll recognize rap icon Kanye West. Kanye's been canceled a few times, and yet he's still around. One of his more recent cancellations was because of his support of the former president. You can see he's wearing the Make America Great Again hat here, and he has occasionally had some very interesting things to say about Black people and Black politics. One of the cases that my students particularly like to focus on is an utterance that he made during a radio interview, where he said that slavery sounded like a choice to him. In that moment, when people heard this clip, they reacted immediately. And his unfortunate, and I can't let him off the hook here, choice of words was what was the thing that people decided to hold him responsible for, and Kanye was effectively canceled. Chrisette Michele, the singer at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, was also canceled because of her involvement with the 45th presidential campaign and the election. After Michelle decided that she would appear as a singer for the inauguration, Black people, Black listeners of her music in particular, canceled her. They refused to stream her music, go to her concerts, or support her in any way. The call outs for each of these individuals and brands were loud and raucous. They originated in Black communities, particularly among Black communities online. If you haven't heard of them, perhaps that's because they are in parts of Black Twitter, the way Black people use Twitter to talk about issues of concern to our communities and among one another. And they weren't necessarily something that would catch the attention of mainstream media. But we soon learned that canceling folks does. So to tell you a little bit about how I came to do this work, I want to give you just a brief overview of how I've traced what we now call cancel culture over the years. I've been studying Black Twitter since 2010. As part of this roundup from the root, I explained that Black Twitter is made up of a number of different communities. They're personal communities where people are joined and connected and in conversation with others that they may know from places within their physical lives or because of some shared offline commonality. Think about people you connect with if you are in, for instance, a particular community service organization or an alumnus of an esteemed university. There are also thematic nodes or neighborhoods. These are the areas, the topics of conversation that people return to again and again. When I explain this to my students, I tell them that I'm a member of an academic Twitter neighborhood, a Blackademic Twitter neighborhood, and every Thursday night, starting at 8, sometimes 9 o'clock, I am an active member of the Shondaland neighborhood, where those of us who love Shonda Rhimes' shows on ABC gather to talk with one another, to live tweet, and to engage in conversation. Finally, the last level of community connection within Black Twitter is the meta network. This is what most people are talking about when they're talking about Black Twitter. When they've seen that there's a particular trend or story that has emerged online that's closely linked to Black culture, and they don't necessarily have any idea about it, you're generally seeing the work of Black Twitter. Black Twitter caught Farhad Manjoo's attention in 2010 when he wrote this story for Slate about how Black people use Twitter. And this is where my research on Black Twitter actually began. In 2010, I was still a newspaper editor in Tallahassee, Florida. I was clicking through headlines to see what was the latest news of the day when I came across this one. Now, headlines are supposed to convey essentially the meaning, the scope of a story in just a few words. You have the headline at the very top, how Black people use Twitter, and then a sub-headline, the second line there, the latest research on race and microblogging. Together, these two things are supposed to indicate to readers what the gist of a story is. But for a person like me, who is a trained copy editor, I immediately took issue with the framing of this story. It paints a pretty broad brush. If you don't know any Black people on Twitter, if you don't use Twitter yourself, you might think that this is just the way Twitter is used, when in fact, it's not. Farhad Manjoo focused on Black media elites to tell this story and on another researcher, framing this issue of Black people and Black tags as something that was aberrant, different, somehow even deviant. So over the years, I traced Black Twitter, and recently I came to these questions. After identifying these levels of community connection, I asked the questions about how mainstream media news values skew the intention of Black women and femmes, non-binary and queer social media users of color who are engaged in the work of digital accountability practice. That's what I call being called in, called out, or canceled, something wholly different than what it means when we say cancel culture. Second to that question, recognizing that there's absolutely nothing new under the sun, I wanted to ask the question about the use of the term culture in specific. That is, how does the silent invocation of the 90s era culture wars rhetoric further enable the misinterpretation of what it means to be canceled? So in the 1980s, James Davison Hunter, who is another faculty member here at UVA, wrote this book, The Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. And in it, Hunter holds that discourse, public discourse in particular, is the realm of media elites. It is a space where culture is made. And so those public conversations that take place on newspaper pages at the time, but now on media websites, on social media, in our text messages, in group chats, in Facebook posts. That public discourse has gotten away from media elites. It's gotten away from the elite white men that James Davison Hunter was speaking about as those being the people who shape the discourse. Now there are more voices that are heard, whereas they were always there, just not necessarily paid attention to. Features like this one in the New York Times illustrate for us what it means to be a Black person creating art, literary works, and other forms of public discourse. This feature explored what it meant to be a Black American in the words of Black people. This is where I wonder what we are trying to say when we talk about certain culture. I find some issue in the labeling of Black culture as something that is pathologically different, that is deviant, that is somehow a battle for struggle, as Hunter positions it. And so I want us to think a little bit about the culture wars and what it means for news media in particular to fan the flames of the culture wars by using this particular phrase, cancel culture. Now, to understand this, I'm going to walk us through a little bit of theory. Racial grammar, Eduardo Bonilla Silva holds, is this form of speaking without being explicit about racial or racist language. Racial grammar, he says, structures cognition, vision, and even feelings on all sorts of racial matters. This grammar normalizes the standards of white supremacy as the standards for all sorts of social events and transactions. Racial grammar, he says, provides the deep structure, the logic, and the rules of proper composition of racial sentiments, and more importantly, of what can be seen, understood, and even felt about racial matters. But these rules, like all rules, are transacted and negotiated so that the ideological rule and order are always in tension and conflict. What Eduardo has laid out for us is an understanding that there are rules that are being played when we talk about what is happening online and when we place it in these very specific terms. To connect the idea of racial grammar to some things that we may commonly have knowledge of, I want you to think about terms that are used to describe people who are at a disadvantage in our society. For instance, at-risk youth. Think about what it means to talk about the urban center. What euphemisms are we using instead of saying people who are poor, people who are Black, people who are Latino? This is racial grammar, Bonilla Silva holds. It is saying without saying. It is drawing up the schema that we have that helps us to instantly make judgments about what is being said without having to be explicit. It's this same racial grammar that is now being used to call the process of calling someone in, calling them out, or canceling them as cancel culture. Rather than saying that there are mobs of people on the internet, many of them Black, Latino, people of color, Asian, many of them people from the margins. Rather than saying all of this, it's easier, faster, and more easily understood to simply say that cancel culture is afoot. Cancel culture draws up the schema of the culture wars, represented here by the arm wrestling. So on the left side of the picture, you've got the Democrats, more liberal ideologies, more liberal symbolism. On the right, you've got the GOP, you've got more conservative symbolism. And in between are the rest of us, those of us who are caught in these public discourses of what American culture is, what it stands for, and what it means. This is where the context collapse of the word culture has come to bear. As I sought to find out why cancel culture was becoming something that was so widely talked about in our news media lately, I wanted to see exactly where we started to get fixated on this term, culture itself. Again, nothing new under the sun, but in 2014, culture was the word of the year chosen by Merriam Dictionary's users who looked it up more than any other word the year prior. It's important to understand the definition of culture as laid out in the dictionary. The term conveys a kind of academic attention to systematic behavior and allows us to isolate and identify an issue, an idea, or a group. Isolation and identification, to pathologize, to point out a specific kind of systemic behavior and say, that's different. That's something that's not unlike the culture that I know. To assign culture as a pejorative in this case is the problem that we have to confront when we hear the rhetoric of cancel culture. What is cancel culture? Well, it's not this, as a New York Times opinion writer wrote. It's not simply mob rule and people calling out for another person's head because of something they've said or done or failed to do. If you have a young person who's really into YouTube, you might think it's this, drama channels on that particular platform, where different vloggers go back and forth with barbs with each other in order to draw attention to their own feeds. What it means to be drawn in, called out, or canceled actually has a lot to do with intersectional frameworks. You see, calling in, calling out, and canceling people are the type of rhetorical moves that folks on the margins use when they have no other alternative for achieving justice and vindication for themselves or for members of their community. To understand this, we need to consider a number of different factors. Not just the fact that accounts on Twitter are calling for someone's resignation or an apology, but what it means for these individuals to come from a range of backgrounds. How are these backgrounds implicit in their marginalization in our society, pushing them to use digital and social media instead of the norms that we are used to in order to enter public discourse in a way that is often disruptive and attention-getting? I chalk it up to a useful theory of anger. Audre Lorde has written that everything can be used except what is wasteful. You will need to remember this when you are accused of destruction. I think of Audre Lorde's text about anger and the uses of anger in a theoretical form. She talks about how every woman, specifically every woman of color, has this well-stocked arsenal of anger that is particularly useful against racism and sexism. She says that focused with precision, this anger can become a source of energy. And she encourages people on the margins to channel that power. That's a theory of useful anger. Being able to take the power that you have within you as you resist racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia in life, and to do something with it collectively, to serve progress and change. What we're seeing when someone is called in, called out, or canceled on the web is also attributed to digital intersectionality theory. Shusky, Tynes, and Noble have identified digital intersectionality theory as something that focuses on the countering of dominant discourses on social media, the way that it is less restricted, it's multidimensional. What we see happening when someone gets canceled on any of these platforms is that users are talking back in ways that we are simply not used to. They're mobilizing around topics outside of the view of the mainstream. That's why perhaps you hadn't heard about some of the people who had been canceled more recently, like Kanye West or Chrisette Michele earlier in the slideshow. When these topics go viral, they gain attention of news media and of people who otherwise wouldn't really be bought into the controversy. They force people to think about their own positions to the controversy. Moving ahead a little bit faster than I intended here, one of the examples of this was this tweet called my back in December of 2014. If you recognize that phrase, it's because it comes from this bridge called my back. It's a work put together by a number of Latina feminists to talk about their struggles in the academy and in the world at large. Black feminists on Twitter created this hashtag in December 2014 after seeing that their labor was being co-opted and profited from without any credit. A group of these Black feminists issued the statement you see here and used the signal, this tweet called my back, to mark their occasion of leaving the platform. It was one of those forms of digital resistance and digital intersectionality at work. To talk about calling in, calling out, and canceling people, I want to do just a little bit of disambiguation. So Loretta Ross is a professor who works on the idea of call-out culture. It's something that she says is toxic because not everyone has the same aims and not everyone comes from the same position. And in that, she's right. But what Ross fails to recognize and fails to center in her analysis is that call-out culture is a necessary evil for those who have no other means of drawing attention to the harms that come to themselves and their communities. There may be better ways of doing social justice work. In fact, Ross would hold that the exchange you see here is indicative of some of those better ways. These are tweets by Alyssa Milano, the former child actress, who talked about being called in by Brittany Packnett, a social activist, in 2019 after Milano tweeted that she didn't recognize her country. Milano says that based on an exchange she had in direct messages on Twitter, she learned from Packnett that this has always been what the country, the United States, was like. What it meant for people who did not share her privilege to be subjected to different harms that she otherwise would not have paid attention to. This is calling in, and calling in requires a relationship, something that most people, when they take to Twitter, Facebook, or other social media platforms in order to draw attention to a problem, don't have. The women whose stories are being told now with reference to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo didn't necessarily have the sort of power that they otherwise might have had if they were nameless, if they were faceless. Those women are reliant on news media getting their stories out and news media effectively advocating for them. But what about the women whose stories we don't hear? The domestic workers, the women of color, the poor women, whose lives and livelihoods depend on their abilities or their willingness, their coercion, to be silent in the face of such oppression. These are the women that Milano forgets when she talks about Me Too. And so Brittany Packnett calls her attention to this. And while we are talking about Me Too moments, she says, this has always been what this country and what this discourse is like. It focuses on the privilege and it forgets those of us who are on the margins. In calling in, Brittany Packnett leveraged her relationship with Alyssa Milano to tap her on the shoulder ever so gently and say, hey, There's a different reality at work here, and you need to pay attention to it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in any rate, there are three things that have always been a part of Black vernacular culture. These are the things that are being truncated and misunderstood as cancel culture. They are reading, dragging, and calling folks out. The podcast, The Read, is based on this very premise. It's two queer identifying Black hosts, Kid Fury and Crystal, take to the end of the podcast that have a segment where they effectively read someone. That is, describe the ills that this person has perpetrated against a particular community. And for lack of better words here, curse them out. Reading someone is to tell them about themselves in terms that they may not like. It's not polite discourse, and it's not meant to be. It's not civil, and it's not meant to be. It is meant to be as bracing and as attention grabbing as the harms that are done to communities that are all too often ignored. I have for you here a couple of examples of what it means to read and to drag and to call people out. The first one here comes from one of my favorite TV shows, no longer on the air, it's in syndication, but this is from the Scandal television show, which was a spinoff of some things that Shonda Rhimes has done. This is the lead character, Olivia Pope, who is a fixer. This is her father, Eli Pope, who is kind of a shadowy guy working in an unofficial capacity for the government. And here he is confronting the president, who is having an affair with Olivia. He's going to do something that we call reading, that is telling Fitz, the president, exactly what his problem is. Let's listen in.
You're funny. You're a funny, funny man.
I am.
Or should I say boy? You're a boy. You've been coddled and cared for, pampered and hugged. For you, it's always summertime and the living is easy. Daddy's rich and your mama's good looking. You're a grand. You got money in your blood. You are a boy. I'm a man. I have worked for every single thing I have ever received. I have fought and scraped and bled for every inch of ground I walk on. I was the first in my family to go to college. My daughter went to boarding school with the children of kings. I made that happen. You cried yourself to sleep because Daddy hurt your feelings, because Papa banged his secretary, because it hurt to have so much money. You spoiled, entitled, ungrateful little brat. You have everything handed to you on a silver platter and you squander it. You're given the world and you can't appreciate it because you haven't had to work for anything. So now you've decided that the one thing that you want is my daughter, my child, mine, what I made, what I created. You could talk about what a great lay she is to try to get a response from me all you want, but guess what? I am actually, quite literally, above your pay grade, which means that I know that you believe that you are in love with her, as wrong as you may be.
I do love her.
You love that she is a door-marked exit. You love that she is your way out. Because if you are with Olivia Pope, you don't have to fulfill your father's dream of being president. If you are with Olivia, you no longer have to be your father's son. An apple never falls too far from the tree. You are always going to be Senator Grant's disappointing boy, Fitz. She is always going to be the formidable Olivia Pope. Don't use the person that I made to make you into a man. You're
a boy. So that's quite a read from Papa Pope. We've got dragging someone that happens next in the next clip.
You're funny. You're a
No
funny, funny
problem.
man. Or should I say boy?
This clip is from True
What did
Blood.
they say, Arlene?
It's gotten away from me. This is Lafayette, who is going to confront a couple of restaurant goers at the restaurant where he is a cook. I will warn you that there is some pretty bracing language in this clip. There are references, pejorative references to gay folks that the character brings up in his reading and calling folks out. Let's listen.
He said the burger might have AIDS.
Here we go. All the heads, chick feel the flow. Big black train coming round.
Lafayette. Oh, fudge.
Excuse me. Who ordered the hamburger with AIDS?
I ordered the hamburger deluxe.
In this restaurant, a hamburger deluxe come with french fries, lettuce, tomato, mayo, and AIDS. Do anybody got a problem with that?
Yeah. I'm an American, and I got a say in who makes my food.
Well, baby, it's too late for that. Faggots been breeding your cows, raising your chickens, even brewing your beer long before I walk my sexy ass up in this motherfucker. Everything on your goddamn table got AIDS.
You still ain't making me eat no AIDS burger.
Well, all you gotta do is say, hold the AIDS. Here.
Forgot about the curse words too. This said, now that you have a couple of examples about reading, dragging, and calling folks out, I want to explain this in the context of Black digital resistance. This is the theoretical framework that I've come up with to explain what happens when Black Twitter's personal communities in its neighborhoods join together to talk about something, some incendiary event, and to draw attention to it. This is what we're talking about when we talk about Black Twitter as a whole. It is also where we see some of the crossover between canceling someone and what has now been labeled as cancel culture. So in the summer of 2013, Black Twitter had what I call a summer of accountability. In June, the tweets, top right-hand section of the slide, come from Paula's Best Dishes, which at the time was the name of Paula Deen's television show. But in this case, people were reacting to the release of a deposition in which the celebrity chef admitted that she had used racist language in the workplace and that she had openly fantasized about having an antebellum South-style dinner. By mashing up traditional Southern and soul food dishes with coded references to racism, people used the hashtag Paula's Best Dishes to call Paula Deen out about her racism in a way that was humorous and unlike discourse that we had seen in other spaces before. In July of that same summer, more and again, Jeannie Lauren tweeted that she remembered what it was like when Black Twitter essentially called out Paula Deen. Deen's endorsement deals were dropped, and she ultimately issued 3 apologies for the language for her conduct. And calling up that memory, Lauren decided to circulate a petition to get the publisher from the George Zimmerman trial, of a juror from the George Zimmerman trial, to drop the book deal that had arisen out of that trial itself. She petitioned Charlene Martin and got more than 1,000 other people to sign this petition within a few hours, which at that time was enough to get a publisher to pay attention and to decide to drop the book deal. In August, Mickey Kendall and Jamie Nesbitt Golden were having a conversation with one another, And as it turned out that an academic, a white man who had taken up space in feminist circles and attempted to silence them in years past, confessed about what he had done on Twitter, they noticed that the white feminists that they kept company with were awfully quiet. And they came up with the hashtag, "Solidarity is for white women." It's actions in cases like these that are being misconstrued as quote unquote cancel culture, as the behavior of an online mob, one that people don't want to necessarily name as Black or women, queer people, or any way different from themselves, but want to be able to write off, to discredit, and to delegitimize the strategies that they use in order to draw attention to their concerns. The most obvious example of what it means for someone to be called out is the use of the Black Lives Matter hashtag. In using Black Lives Matter and demanding that others recognize the phrase and what it means, what its intent was when it was created by Alicia Garza, protesters across the country were drawing attention to issues of police brutality, of reproductive justice, of workers' rights, of immigrants' rights, and much more. This sort of behavior, this organizing, is what is being crunched into this term, cancel culture. To call out, to protest, to be raucous. It's being written off as speech that isn't polite, that doesn't follow the norms of discourse, and that is moving American culture in an unsavory direction for people who have long enjoyed positions of power. Unfortunately, we've seen that some of our own politicians have used this phrase to talk about activism that they don't understand. The former president, Barack Obama, mentioned that call-out culture wasn't activism, that being judgmental and calling people to task for things that they have said or done, or perhaps any inaction that they haven't taken, isn't justifiable in terms of what we think of as activism. I beg to differ, and have through my research, that this indeed is activism. It's simply one form of it, and one form that is different from the rules of conversation that we're used to. The problem with collapsing, calling people in, calling them out, and canceling them into cancel culture is that it assigns deviance and difference to the people who are demanding accountability. In the conversations that I've had since I've begun to do this research, I've heard more people push for other ways to talk about it, as consequences culture, as accountability culture. It's the sort of conversation that I want to push us towards as we get ready to close and think about productive dialogue. How then do we engage in productive dialogue that isn't quite what some want to label as cancel culture? First, we recognize real threats to speech. This executive order, issued toward the end of 2020, sought to address what some saw as a problem: critical race theory, an approach that examines relations of power within media, law, and other American institutions to draw out what it means to be oppressed along specific lines. Critical race theory is now a buzzword among people who often don't give a definition and misidentify the application and use of critical race theory as an analytic. It's simply that. It is another means of theoretically seeing and making sense of the world around us. For the country, for the highest office in the land to issue an executive order forbidding such speech is actual censorship. This is a threat to speech, not so-called cancel culture. We should also demand accountability from responsible parties. Governor Andrew Cuomo has attempted to deflect attention from himself by saying that the allegations made against him are acts of cancel culture. Rather than repeating this language in the news media and the stories that are published, rather than simply accepting this definition It is up to us, the public, those of us who are engaged in these discourses, to push back, to demand definitions of what someone means when they say cancel culture, to demand accountability for the issue at hand. Rather than engaging in conversation about the discourse itself, we should push both the press and our public officials to talk about the issues that are of concern. Finally, we can take our own actions. These are two everyday people who have become viral, famous, vortex public figures, as we say in media studies, for their activism, for calling out, for canceling, for dragging and reading people in contexts that we're not used to. On the left, KJ Brooks spoke up at a Kansas City meeting of commissioners and said from the outset that she did not seek to be respectable. So the speech that she was about to follow with was not something that she was trying to do to curry favor or to be seen as a Black woman who was particularly articulate or respectable. She wanted to be heard about the urgent threat that she saw being posed against residents in Kansas City. Similarly, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Gary Chambers, a parent, went to the school board meeting to protest this action about not taking down a Confederate name on a school. He called out one of the board members, prompting her to get up and leave. She was shopping, and Chambers engaged that directly on the mic in a way that doesn't fit the norms of discourse and debate that we're used to. This is the kind of language and approach that we cannot fear. We have to understand how to embrace, how to recognize speech and activism patterns that are different than the ones that we are used to. We're living in a differently mediated age. And with this, I offer you my perspective on what it means to be called out, called in, and canceled. It's all boiling down to the fact that cancel culture is in fact the work of digital accountability politics as it is reformed by racial grammar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. Wanted to reserve a few minutes, couple of minutes for any questions. Right now, we don't have any questions submitted, so I want to encourage everyone again to submit any question you may have or questions about clarification, anything you want to ask. Just to start us off, I wanted to ask a question about this idea of presentism. I was recently exposed to this term presentism, which is like using present day standards to hold folks accountable for past behaviors, right? So what are your thoughts about, presentism and its influence on the approach for accountability?
I did not realize that we had a term for this now. So I take issue with the label of using today's standards to judge the past. They are today's standards in that today there are more people whose speech is recognized. There are more people with access to the mechanisms to be part of public discourse in ways that we weren't before. And there are social norms that we have agreed upon through literal blood, sweat, and tears that we are now using to think about who we were and who we want to be. And rather than using this label of presentism, I think we should talk about this as evolution. This is a form of social evolution, and all societies evolve. It is something that happened with the very creation of this country over and over again. We are now living through a period of social evolution. I'm used to hearing that more in the sense of revision and revisionist history. where people criticize the move to take down Confederate monuments, to rename those schools that were named after Confederate generals or people who had similarly problematic histories. That isn't revisionism to me either. What we are talking about is presenting a more complete picture of history. So I'll have to think about this some and come up with a nice catchy term myself. But I'm thinking about the work of completion and what it means to be more inclusive with the way that we think about our world.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So I do see two questions here that I'll read out loud. It says, Maria says, where exactly, like the year or the situation to occur, did the cancel culture start?
Oh, that's a really good question. So that's the thing about language, right? There's not one specific moment where we can point to and say, that is the thing, that is where cancel culture began. Because when we talk about those analog antecedents of reading, of dragging, of calling people out, those are things that had been taking place in communities of color for years. So E. Patrick Johnson, for instance, is a writer who talks about what it is like to be a Black queer man in the South, and how he has used his background to make sense of his world. And one of his writings is on queering ethnography and thinking about what it means to be queer. And in that, he talks about his grandmother reading him. And so reading in this sense is being told about yourself, even though you didn't give someone the specific information that they needed in order to make that assessment of your character. So it's always been going on in that way. What has happened is that the language that is taking place, the language that's being used online, has essentially become a meme. An internet meme being something that, an idea, a phrase, we often think of it in terms of the pictures with block letters on them to express a phrase. But a meme is just an idea. And canceling has become a meme in that sense. And in order to quickly make sense of it, people call it a culture. They say that it is something that is done by a particular group, and in that they are trying to identify and cut out a certain segment of people and say that this is a certain pathology, this is a particular kind of culture. And people who engage in discourse this way are part of this culture. And if we can identify them as part of this culture, I think about the culture of poverty and those debates some 10, 20, 30 years ago and beyond. If you can identify something as being specific to one culture, then you can suppress it, you can marginalize it, you can dismiss it. And so that's a process that has taken place over time. But if I had to point to a specific instance, for me, I would say it was after that 2018 article came out in the paper of record, where being canceled got recognized, and then soon it became quote unquote cancel culture.
Gotcha. So we have only 1 minute left. I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer, I see 3 more questions here, but I do want to remind everyone to submit the feedback form for us. It will take less than 90 seconds. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions. We thank you, Dr. Clark. You are certainly welcome to drop any contact info you wish to in the chat. If you're interested in getting in touch with Dr. Clark. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to hang tight, maybe we can answer a couple more questions, but you're certainly welcome to exit at this point. And look out for one more program from the Multicultural Center. Next month is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So we certainly hope that you will stay in tune for upcoming programs. We hope that you have a safe and fruitful rest of the week. And those who want to hang in for more questions, you're welcome. We'll probably be on for about 5 more minutes. Okay. Says, how can we help folks on the margin to feel more inclusive, to have more equity? How do we listen better? Oh, the answer is in the question. It is
listening. And there are a number of different ways for us to listen now, right? The ability for us to listen to people on the margins was always present. And I say that not to inspire guilt, but to let people know that the ways that I suggest we listen to people on the margins aren't all that new. And you don't have to do something that is that takes a big heavy lift to get it done, right? I think about that listening as picking up and paying attention to publications that aren't directed towards the group that you are in, for instance. So as a girl, when I had long hair, I grew up going to the salon and I would read magazines like Essence. And of course, we got Ebony and Jet at home. And those magazines are directed towards Black people, talking about our lifestyles, the concerns that are specific to Black communities. And I do stress the S because there are multiple communities in any group. That's one way to listen. Another way to listen is to pay attention to programming that is directed at specific groups. And with any sort of media consumption, of course, you want to know who made it, who is it intended for, what messages in this might be problematic. But then the easiest way to listen is to pay attention to the people in the world around you. It is astonishing to me as I'm reading tweets related to Stop Asian Hate about how many of our Asian and Asian American brothers and sisters feel like they have been ignored over the years. Not just East Asians, we are talking about Southeast Asians as well. We're talking about South Asians. Just what it means to pay attention to their lived experiences. You know, one of the things that I say to people that I encourage anytime I do a talk like this is that when you leave, my aim is for you to make eye contact with people out in the world, to acknowledge them, to say hello to them in ways that you may not have before. We have become so accustomed to ignoring people who are not like us that it is one of the lowest barriers of entry that we can think of in terms of getting started with listening.
Thank you. And I do see one additional question here. I'll just read the whole paragraph. Professor Clark, this pandemic era has put racial, social, and political tension front and center in the US. People are reacting to various comments from the public personalities with calling out or canceling. What kind of approach should a predominantly white institution, university, use to help its students from different backgrounds learn to discuss issues without fear of canceling or calling out? In other words, how can we teach our students to discuss tough issues?
It's a great question. So this is something that takes multiple levels of attention. We have to think about it in the classroom space, and that is the responsibility of the professor to create a space where, and I want to switch this a little bit because when we focus on addressing someone's fear of being called out or canceled, we are actually paying more attention and giving more weight to people who have privileged positions than those who are on the margins and do need to be able to speak in very frank ways. But creating spaces where we can have conversations without fear of being socially ostracized is hard. It's difficult. And as a professor, I open the courses that I teach by saying that the classroom is a space for learning. And in that sense, we have to agree to allow each other the grace to engage in conversations that are difficult, that we may not always have the language for. And I make the admission to my students that I do not always have the language. And I think standing up and being that example and being able to say that to students puts them at ease. The other thing on the classroom level in particular is that we remind our students that in our conversations, we always seek to recognize and uphold the dignity of every person, period. If there's language that you don't understand or you don't know how to use, if you're fearful about speaking out, there is nothing wrong with saying that, so that people understand exactly where you are and where you're coming from. I think we have to let go of our fear of, this is essentially a fear about rupture, about being left out. And we have to relax just a little bit. On an organizational and institutional level, we really need to think about the policies that we have. So many universities have been caught flat-footed, not knowing what to say when someone, a member of the faculty, a student, someone connected to the university community is being called out. We have to uphold the ideals that we claim to stand for, and that is open debate and discourse and freedom of expression. We also have to recognize what those limits are socially, and we have to commit to doing the very best we can.
Awesome, thank you so much. I don't think we have any additional questions here. So everyone who stayed with us after the session was over, we thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or Dr. Clark an email to reach out to her. I'm hoping everyone has a wonderful week. Take care.
Thanks.